I was supposed to be finishing writing Act 1 of my book this week, but I got depressed and inspiration left right in my face. So, let's paint a fairy to feel some joy. Please and thank you. I started just by blocking out the very basic sketch. I never go too detailed with these because I don't want the graphite to muddy the color when I start layering watercolor paints and pencils over it. Plus, this allows for me to change details later on. With watercolor pencils, I've learned the hard way that it works better for me to build up layers of color slowly rather than coloring everything in and then adding water to it all at the same time. So I start with the light colors, or colors which I intend to blend together, like the pink and purple here in the skirt. And then once the water has dried on that layer, then I start moving on to other colors. Watercolor pencils are easier to control than watercolor paints themselves. However, I do find that focusing on individual layers or sections of color helps manage where everything ends up, because watercolor paint does tend to run away if it has too much water involved. So it's a little less messy to focus on one color at a time and then let that dry before moving on to the next. When thinking about the design for this fairy, I wanted something to balance out the color scheme of the existing fairies that I've done for the series that I'm working on, the predominant colors of which have been orange and green and pink and purple. So for this fairy, I decided to do a sort of pansy-like design where there would be a blend of pink, purple, orange, and gold, as well as my standard greens and browns, so that everything starts to feel cohesive as a series overall. I always try to be very intentional about which colors go where to strike a visual sort of balance. So I decided to do something different for the fairy's shoes this time because I knew there would be plenty of green between the sort of corset top situation and the stem of the pansy flower that she would be looking at. I had been doing green shoes on all of the other fairies in the series so far. However, I knew that there needed to be another point of orange, so I decided to switch things up and make the shoes orange this time. I decided to give this fairy twin braids in honor of one of my favorite characters and series and books of all time, which is Anne of Green Gables. I may or may not have made Anne my whole personality at various points in my life, but that's neither here nor there. In very important news, I found my pencil sharpener. I thought I had lost it, and I'm very happy to see its safe return. Another thing I learned very quickly when I started experimenting with watercolor pencils was that I had a great need for the use of the pencil sharpener. For these fairy paintings, I tend to use watercolor pencils for the main features of the image and then use watercolor paint when I need to build up texture somewhere. So that's usually grass or the background, that kind of thing. So I'll show that a little bit later on. But it mostly just depends on what feels right for that individual piece. So I like to blend between different uses of the medium. This is where leaving things open in the sketch stage comes in handy, because I didn't know for sure until I was working on the skirt that this flower here would be a pansy. But now that I have figured out the overall visual design of this piece, I know that there needs to be another pansy to balance out the design of the skirt. So at this point then I go in and add in the details of the pansy flower itself to echo the pattern and design of the skirt. I also use all of the same colors that I've used before, adding a little bit of pink to the lower petals so that it will match the lower part of the skirt, and bringing in a little bit more of the darker purple to differentiate the upper petals from the lower ones. And again, I only bring in water one little bit at a time. So here I'm doing this one petal at a time so that I don't accidentally muddy up all of my colors. Sometimes if I've accidentally added too much water, I will sort of move the color around until it's somewhat smooth and then go to a slightly different area and use up that water there, and then come back to the initial area and smooth out things so that the color is even, which is what happened with this larger upper petal here. I'm not generally too precise about flower stems unless there's any specific need to be, so I'll usually just put in the color appropriately and blend it out with the paintbrush. And here is where I start bringing in the actual watercolor paint. So what I like to do for grasses or moss or that sort of texture is I like to start out with one lighter color green and take an old cheap paintbrush and get the paintbrush completely covered in paint and then just smash it into the paper and do so in a way that leaves the paint sort of uneven on the page. And then what I will do is go in and do the same thing with a darker color green and just continue to build up layers of that until it looks right to me. The wings really puzzled me on this fairy for a while. I like to use real butterfly wings as an inspiration and then sort of make them my own a little bit, and also make sure that the wings complement the rest of the piece. So I spent a long time looking at different butterfly wings, and eventually I arrived at the common buckeye as my sort of inspiration. And I definitely messed with the design to add in purple instead of sort of black-blue colors, and highlighted the orange and purple within the wings. But yeah. Then I had some trouble actually figuring out how I wanted to make the wings happen, so to speak. I started just by filling in all of the colors, so building up the main body of brown and the points of purple and orange. But by the time that I had finished adding in all of the brown, it felt dark enough that it overwhelmed the fairy herself, and so I spent a little bit of time trying to figure out what to do about that, and I forgot to video some of it, so it'll just jump to when I had figured out the solution. Which was, I added water to the brown that I knew was going to be too dark, and then took a bit of tissue and while it was still wet would dab at it so that it would lift up some of the color, which also added a bit of smoothness to the wing, which I thought was kind of fun, and continued doing that until the whole wing had been filled in and had color lifted up from it. At which point then I brought in the brown that I used for her hair and added sort of veins to the wing to give it some more texture and definition. And then it was time for the face, and this face gave me a lot more trouble than I would have liked, considering that it already had a layer of watercolor paint underneath of it, and it was rather hard to erase once that is in place. However, here we are. I just sort of experimented with small little dots because that's basically all you can afford to do on a face at this scale, and tried to get them all in the right place so that everything looked right. It was an experience of trial and error, which is usually what happens when I'm trying to do faces. But eventually I got it right, and with that, the fairy was done. Thank you for watching. I'm experimenting with different ways to make these sorts of videos, so I really appreciate it, and I hope this video brought a little dash of magic your way, especially if you were in need of it. I know I was today. And yeah, I hope to see you in the next video. Until next time.